In 2000, Kozmo.com raised $280 million in venture funding and launched in 11 major American cities. The company promised one-hour delivery of books, videos, food, and convenience items from local stores directly to customers' homes. In 2001, it shut down, having burned through most of its capital. In 2013, a company called Instacart launched with a similar proposition: grocery delivery within hours. It raised $44 million in its first 2 years, compared to Kozmo's $280 million in 2. By 2022, Instacart was valued at approximately $39 billion. In 2000, a company called Urban Fetch launched in New York, promising one-hour delivery of anything from a central warehouse. Investors including J.P. Morgan backed it. It shut down within a year. In 2014, Amazon launched Prime Now one-hour delivery in major cities. It operates profitably at scale. Same proposition. Different decades. Dramatically different outcomes. The gap between the 2000 companies and the 2013 and after companies was not primarily a gap in management quality, capital allocation, or strategic vision. It was a gap in infrastructure conditions. In 2000, the mobile phone that would have allowed customers to order on the way home from work didn't exist. The GPS mapping that would have made delivery routing efficient enough to generate acceptable unit economics at scale didn't exist in the form required. The gig economy labor pool that would have made last-mile delivery a variable cost rather than a fixed cost didn't exist. The right idea at the wrong moment is not a near miss. It is a full failure with full costs. To investors, to employees, to the entrepreneurs who spent years building something that couldn't work yet. Understanding why requires examining not just what the idea was, but what the idea required and whether what it required was present. The fundamental analytical error in most timing failures is the conflation of market existence with market readiness. These are different conditions. A market can exist, customers can demonstrably want a product and still not be ready if the infrastructure conditions required to deliver the product at viable economics are not yet present. Kozmo's market existed. There were customers who wanted one-hour delivery of convenience items. There were customers who demonstrated this want by using Kozmo's service. The company's transaction volumes in its major cities were real. What did not exist was the combination of infrastructure conditions that would have made those transactions economically viable, the mobile ordering that would drive order frequency, the GPS optimization that would reduce delivery cost per unit, the shared last-mile infrastructure that would make delivery a variable cost at any volume. Without those conditions, Kozmo's cost per delivery was too high to sustain at the price customers were willing to pay. The company could acquire customers, it demonstrably did. It could generate transactions, it demonstrably did. It could not generate transactions at a cost structure that produced a viable business. The infrastructure conditions that were absent in 2000 arrived incrementally across the following decade. The smartphone in 2007. Google Maps turn-by-turn navigation in 2008. The gig economy labor model in 2009 to 2012. By 2013, each of the conditions that had made Kozmo's model unviable was present in Instacart, building on the same fundamental proposition, could operate at unit economics that were structurally unavailable in 2000. Have you ever seen a business model dismissed as unviable when the actual problem was that the infrastructure conditions required to make it viable hadn't arrived yet? Leave a comment. The business school analysis of timing failures typically focuses on being early as a market position, the idea that being early creates an advantage that later entrants will benefit from. This analysis is correct in some cases. It is specifically wrong in the category of failures where the early company doesn't survive to see the conditions that would have made its model viable. Kozmo did not create a market that Instacart entered later. Kozmo failed. Instacart rebuilt the market from scratch, in the conditions that made it possible. The consumer awareness that Kozmo's $280 million in marketing created did not transfer to Instacart's benefit in any meaningful direct way. The consumer who had used Kozmo in 2000 and watched it fail had updated their belief that this kind of service was viable. Instacart had to overcome that negative update, not build on a positive one. The conventional wisdom, being early is like being wrong, is closer to the truth than being early creates a first-mover advantage. For businesses where the core model depends on infrastructure conditions that don't yet exist, being early is not a market position. It is a structural impossibility that consumes capital and organizational energy on a problem that the current infrastructure cannot solve. The practical question that most early-stage businesses ask is there a market for this? The more useful question is the infrastructure that this market requires to be served viably currently present? These are different questions. The first can be answered with customer surveys, user testing, and early transaction data. The second requires a more specific analysis. What does this model require to be economically viable, and is each of those requirements currently met? If the infrastructure analysis that distinguishes the market exists from the infrastructure is ready is the level of analytical precision you come here for. The like is the direct signal. The employees who built Kozmo, the warehouse staff, the delivery workers, the technology team were working on something that would have worked in 2013. They were doing it in 2000. The gap between those 2 years is not a gap in their effort, their skill, or their commitment to the mission. It is a gap in the infrastructure conditions that existed outside their control. This matters in a specific way that is usually absent from timing failure post-mortems. The narrative of, "it was too early," places the timing failure in the realm of bad luck, or poor foresight, something the company's leadership failed to accurately assess. This narrative is partially accurate. It is also incomplete, because it doesn't account for the genuine impossibility of building a viable business at a time when the infrastructure conditions required to make it viable are not yet present, regardless of how good the execution is. The Webvan warehouse staff who lost their jobs in 2001 were not employed by a company that failed because of poor execution. The warehouses were impressive. The logistics were sophisticated. The technology was state-of-the-art for 2001. The business failed because the unit economics of last-mile grocery delivery in 2001 acquired a cost structure that the infrastructure of 2001 could not provide. Instacart's founders understood this distinction when they launched in 2013. They did not claim to have a better strategy than Webvan. They understood that the strategy was the same, and that the infrastructure conditions were different. That's the entire thesis. It is both simpler and more analytically rigorous than "they had a better team" or "they had better execution" framing that is typically applied to second-generation success after first-generation failure. The practical thing, for any business model that has previously failed, the useful question is not, why did it fail? The useful question is, what were the specific infrastructure conditions it required? Which of those were absent at the time of failure, and which of those are present now? If the answer to the third part of that question is, all of them, the business model is not risky because it failed before. It is de-risked because the prior failure generated knowledge about what the model requires and confirmed that demand exists, and the current infrastructure conditions address the specific reasons the model was unviable. This analysis is the inverse of the typical venture pattern, which treats prior failure in a category as a negative signal about the category. Prior failure in a category is only a negative signal about the current infrastructure conditions if those conditions have not changed. If they have changed in the specific ways that the prior failure identified as necessary, prior failure is a positive signal, a documented market with documented demand that has never been served by a viable business. The 3 or 4 companies that will define the next generation of commerce-related services are probably building on exactly this structure today. A market that has previously failed for infrastructure reasons, in infrastructure conditions that have recently become adequate to make it viable. The challenge is identifying which infrastructure conditions have recently changed and which prior failures were blocked by exactly those conditions. The next episode looks at a case where the identification was made correctly, where a company correctly assessed that the prior failures in its category were infrastructure failures rather than market failures, and where the subsequent execution produced a different kind of problem than the one the infrastructure analysis had prepared for. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical Stoicism.